It's the photograph you've seen 100 times, maybe 1,000. Rosa Parks sitting quietly at the front of a Montgomery bus, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Behind her, a white man stares ahead, jaw set, eyes fixed somewhere far from hers. It looks simple, serene, a moment frozen in time, the instant when one woman changed history. But what if I told you that this photograph, the one etched into textbooks, murals, and memory, wasn't taken that day at all? Not on the day she refused to move, not on the day she was arrested, but later, after the world had already begun to move in her name. In March of 1956, a reporter from Look magazine boarded a Montgomery City bus with Rosa Parks. He asked her to sit in the same seat she'd sat in months earlier, to recreate the moment. A white man, a journalist, sat behind her, completing the scene. And when the shutter clicked, the myth was born. That single image would travel the world. It would become the face of defiance. But it was also something else, a photograph designed to look like history, even if it wasn't quite the real thing. And so, before the marches, before the boycotts, before the speeches that would shake the earth, there was this picture. A picture that made the world believe it understood what had happened on that bus. But if a photograph can be staged, what about the story behind it? Was Rosa's act of defiance truly spontaneous, or part of something carefully planned? And why was a photographer already waiting to capture a movement before it began? The Dusty Ledger opens on that single question, a moment immortalized in silver and shadow, and the truth that may lie just outside the frame. December 1st, 1955, a Thursday evening like any other in Montgomery. The air was heavy with heat and habit, a city moving on rails of routine and segregation. Rosa Parks finished her shift at the Montgomery Fair department store. She was tired, but not from work. Tired of rules that dictated where she could sit, which doors she could enter, how far she could go before someone reminded her who was supposed to be in charge. She dropped her fare into the metal box, took her seat in the middle section, the so-called colored section. The driver was the same one who'd thrown her off a bus years before for daring to enter through the wrong door. And now, as more white passengers boarded, that driver glanced back in his mirror and told her to move. Rosa didn't shout, she didn't argue, she simply said, no. One word, quiet as a whisper, heavy as a hammer. That refusal would echo across the South. Police were called. She was arrested, booked, fingerprinted, her image captured under harsh fluorescent light, not the soft glow of that famous photograph. And in the stillness of a cell, a movement began to stir. But here's the question that history rarely lingers on. Was this the moment of spontaneous rebellion we've been taught, or the spark of a plan already smoldering behind the scenes? Because before Rosa Parks took that seat, others had already taken the fall, and one of them was just 15 years old. 9 months before Rosa Parks ever boarded that bus, another seat was taken and refused. Her name was Claudette Colvin, 15 years old, a student at Booker T. Washington High, a girl who'd been learning about the Constitution, about freedom, equality, justice, and wondering why none of it seemed to apply to her. It was March 2nd, 1955, a Thursday afternoon. Claudette had just left school, books in her arms, mind still racing with lessons about her rights as an American citizen. She climbed aboard a crowded Montgomery bus, paid her fare, and took a seat in the colored section, just as the law demanded. Then came that familiar command, "You need to move." But Claudette didn't move. Not that day. Not this time. Later, she'd say it felt as though Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth were standing beside her, holding her in place. She looked up at the driver and said, softly, "I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right to sit here." The police boarded the bus. They dragged her down the aisle, handcuffed her wrists, and threw her into the back of a squad car. 15 years old, charged with violating segregation laws, assault, and disorderly conduct. But there were no reporters waiting outside, no cameras, no speeches, only silence and shame, forced upon her by a society that didn't want a young, dark-skinned, unwed girl to be the face of resistance. Because soon after her arrest, word spread that Claudette was pregnant, and for the men and women leading Montgomery's NAACP, that complicated things. Too young, too poor, too unpolished, they said. Not the image they needed to ignite a movement. So Claudette Colvin's act of courage was quietly tucked away, filed in reports, whispered about in church basements, forgotten by history textbooks. But make no mistake, when Rosa Parks refused to move, the ground she stood on had already been broken by a 15-year-old girl whose name the world was never meant to remember. And that raises a haunting question. Was Rosa Parks chosen because her story was more powerful, or because it was more comfortable? By the time Rosa Parks boarded that bus in December 1955, the ground had already been laid. The city of Montgomery was a powder keg, and all it needed was a spark that the world would finally see. Rosa wasn't a random passenger that day. She was a quiet force, the secretary of the local NAACP, a seasoned activist who'd spent years documenting injustices and helping victims of racial violence. She had attended workshops on nonviolent resistance, written letters, gathered testimonies. She was tired, yes, but also prepared. When the police took her fingerprints, she didn't cry. She straightened her coat, lifted her chin, and faced the flash of the camera. Within hours, the NAACP was mobilizing. Within days, the Montgomery Improvement Association had formed, and at its head stood a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. Flyers were printed, urging every black resident in Montgomery to stay off the buses. A one-day protest turned into a week, then a month, then more than a year. 381 days. 381 mornings of walking miles to work, of carpooling, praying, and refusing to yield. And it all centered on that one quiet act, a woman who had refused to give up her seat. But even in the triumph of organization and faith, the question lingers in the background. Was Rosa's moment on that bus a flash of defiance, or the ignition of a plan carefully set in motion by those who knew the world was finally ready to listen? Because while Rosa Parks's courage was undeniably real, so was the strategy, the timing, the understanding that this time the story had to stick. Movements need symbols, and Rosa Parks, poised, dignified, unshakable, became the face a movement could rally behind, a hero crafted not out of illusion, but out of intention. By the spring of 1956, Rosa Parks was no longer just a woman from Montgomery. She was a symbol, a living image of courage. And in the age before television, when stories were told through black and white photographs, symbols needed faces. So one afternoon, a journalist from Look magazine boarded a Montgomery city bus with Rosa Parks. They asked her to sit in the same seat she'd refused to surrender months earlier. A white man, a colleague of the photographer, sat behind her. And when the shutter snapped, the world was given the moment it had already imagined. That photograph wasn't taken on December 1st. It wasn't taken during the arrest. It was taken after the boycotts had begun, after the legend had already taken root. And yet, that's the image that history chose to remember. The calm defiance, the quiet dignity, the poised heroine staring forward while segregation sat just behind her shoulder. Was it staged? Yes, in the most literal sense, but perhaps not in spirit. Because movements understand something that truth alone cannot always achieve. That image is power. A single photograph can carry a message across oceans, can move hearts faster than 1,000 court rulings ever could. The world didn't want a mugshot of Rosa Parks in a police station. It wanted a picture of strength, of calm defiance, of righteousness seated where it didn't belong. But there's an unease that lingers in that frame. If the photograph was recreated, what else in our collective memory has been edited? Where does history end and storytelling begin? That single staged image became the truth the world accepted. It immortalized Rosa Parks and quietly erased the chaos, the fear, and the dozens of other faces who never made it into the frame. Because sometimes, history isn't written by the victors, but by the photographers. History is not fair. It doesn't remember everyone who deserves to be remembered, only those who fit the story it wants to tell. After the buses went quiet and the boycotts began, Rosa Parks became that story. Her name was printed in newspapers around the world. Her photograph, that carefully composed image, became the face of a new America being born. But behind the glow of flashbulbs and speeches, others were left in the shadows. Claudette Colvin, the 15-year-old who'd sat first, never saw her name carved into monuments or written into songs. She was young, poor, dark-skinned, and to the movement's strategists, complicated. The leaders of the NAACP understood the brutal reality of public perception. They knew the movement needed a symbol the world could rally behind, someone who looked respectable, composed, unthreatening to white America. And Rosa Parks fit that image perfectly. A seamstress, owned a car, married, educated, soft-spoken, the kind of woman the headlines could love. So Claudette's story was quietly tucked away, and the narrative, the one we still teach, was shaped around the woman who came next. But there's a price for every perfect story. When we polish history until it gleams, we lose the rough edges, the parts that made it real. Was it wrong for the movement to choose Rosa, or was it necessary? Maybe both. Because revolutions aren't only built on truth, they're built on strategy. And so, history made its choice. Rosa Parks became the icon the world could believe in, and Claudette Colvin became a footnote, the girl who sparked a fire no one was ready to see. Because every movement has its symbol, and every symbol casts a shadow. In the end, it doesn't matter if that photograph was staged, or if Rosa Parks knew exactly what she was doing when she refused to stand. What matters is what that single act became. A spark, lit not by accident, but by timing, courage, and centuries of quiet endurance. A moment so simple that it could slip past unnoticed, yet powerful enough to move a nation. History, after all, is not just written by heroes. It's sculpted by strategy, by symbolism, by the need to turn chaos into clarity. Maybe that's why Rosa Parks' story survived where Claudette's did not. Because Rosa's defiance was easy to believe in, tidy, graceful, and morally unshakable. It gave the civil rights movement a face the world could not ignore. But beneath the textbooks and the memorials lies a deeper truth, that real change is never neat. It's messy, contradictory, full of people whose courage doesn't always fit the narrative. And maybe that's what we're meant to remember, that Rosa Parks didn't stand alone, that before her, Claudette Colvin, and so many others, had already taken that seat in defiance. The bus that day was more than metal and vinyl. It was a stage where history rehearsed itself, where strategy met conviction, and where one woman's calm became a nation's roar. Because sometimes, the truth of a story isn't found in the moment it happened, but in the echo it leaves behind. And like so many stories we uncover here on the Dusty Ledger, it reminds us that the past is never truly past. It lingers, written in the silence between the flash of a camera and the turning of a page.